The fluorescent lights hummed their familiar dirge at 2 in the morning, a sound that had become the metronome of Danielle Ross's life for the past 5 years. She moved through the ICU of Mercy General in San Diego with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that every motion counted, every second mattered, every detail could mean the difference between breathing and not breathing. Her scrubs hung loose on a frame that had once carried 70 pounds of tactical gear through the streets of Fallujah. Now they draped over a woman whose desert tan had faded into the pale complexion of someone who existed only under artificial light, in the spaces between midnight and dawn when the hospital belonged to the nurses and the dying. She was 38 years old. Her personnel file said she had been a nurse for 5 years. Her hands knew better. The ICU at Mercy General ran on controlled chaos at night. 3 nurses managing 14 beds. 2 residents sleeping in the call room. 1 attending who checked in by phone. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm in the darkness, each breath a small negotiation between life and the alternative. Danielle restocked the crash cart with methodical precision, checking expiration dates on medications that might save someone or might arrive too late. Epinephrine, amiodarone, succinylcholine. The names were the same as they had been 15 years ago, though the doses had changed, the protocols had evolved, the science had advanced. The mechanics of keeping people alive remained fundamentally unchanged. She wore long sleeves despite the heat the hospital kept cranked to keep patients warm. The sleeves covered the scars that ran up both of her forearms like a topographic map of bad decisions made in good faith. 1 scar from a field dressing applied under fire in 2006. Another from a surgical infection that had nearly cost her the use of her right hand. A third from something she didn't talk about, even in the private moments when she sat alone at 3 in the morning, pressing her palm against the smooth white line of tissue and remembering how it felt when the metal had gone through. Her locker was the last one on the row, tucked behind the staff bathroom where no one looked. Inside, folded in plastic that had yellowed slightly despite her care, sat a pair of combat boots. Desert tan Belleville 390s, the soles worn through on the inside of the left heel where she favored that foot when standing for 18 hours straight. The laces were gone, replaced with paracord. The boots had been her feet through 3 deployments, for firefights, and 1 catastrophic night in the Jolin district that the military had decided never happened. No one at Mercy General knew the boots existed. Danielle pushed the crash cart into position at the nursing station and began cross-referencing the patient charts against the pharmacy printout. This was her ritual. This was the thing that made Dr. Hargrove's jaw tighten when he saw her doing it. Every chart. Every medication. Every billing code. She found the discrepancies the way other people found typos, automatically, without conscious effort, the product of a mind trained to process multiple layers of information simultaneously and identify what didn't belong. Patient in bed 7. Cardiac tamponade. The chart showed billing for an echocardiogram performed at 1847 hours. Danielle pulled the imaging log. No echo at 1847 hours. The echo had been performed at 1510 hours, 8 hours before the billing code indicated. Someone had submitted 2 billing codes for a single procedure. Danielle wrote the discrepancy on a sticky note and placed it on the chart. She had done this 43 times in the past 5 years. 43 small pieces of paper noting small inconsistencies. 43 instances of her being exactly what she appeared to be, a quiet nurse who paid attention to detail. The doors to the ICU swished open and Marcus Chen stepped through, still in the khakis and polo shirt he wore in the IT department during the day, though it was now officially his night shift rotation. He was a veteran himself, National Guard, not active duty, not the kind of military that stayed with you the way it stayed with people like Danielle. But he recognized something in her, the way that people who had worn uniforms sometimes recognized each other. Not from anything she said. She rarely said anything. He recognized it from the way she moved, from the fact that she never startled, from the way her eyes tracked the room automatically, always aware of exits and threats and the positions of other people. Morning, Marcus said, and the word carried the weight of something more than a greeting. It was acknowledgement. It was a small nod from one person who understood that the military was something you survived, not something you recovered from. "Morning," Danielle replied, and her voice was quiet but steady, the kind of voice that didn't require volume to communicate clearly. "New infusion pump on 7. Calibration might be off by 2%. "I'll check it," Marcus said, which was his way of saying thank you, which was his way of saying he understood that she was doing his job for him, that she was catching things that might otherwise cascade into problems. He moved toward the room, then paused. "You need anything before I start the rounds?" "Coffee," Danielle said. "If someone made it." "Always do." Marcus smiled, the kind of smile that acknowledged they were both operating on the fumes of people who had learned to function on 4 hours of sleep and the ambient anxiety of keeping people alive. "It's strong enough to stand up by itself tonight." The hospital ran on coffee and the certainty that somewhere, someone was actively dying and would need everyone at their best within the next 4 hours. It was a kind of operating assumption that shaped behavior in ways that civilians couldn't understand. You moved with purpose. You didn't waste motion. You paid attention to details that might seem insignificant until they suddenly became the difference between a patient who recovered and a patient who didn't. Danielle moved to the supply closet and began restocking the code cart. Oxygen tubing. Chest tube trays with the 14-gauge angiocath needles that could mean the difference between pneumothorax management and a patient whose lungs simply stopped exchanging gases. Tape. Gloves. The materials of emergency reduced to their essential components and organized in the order you would need them if someone's heart stopped. Crash carts were beautiful in their way, she thought. They were honesty. They were the hospital admitting that sometimes things fell apart very quickly and you needed to have the right tools ready or you would lose. The ICU doors opened again, and Dr. Hargrove entered like a man who owned the space, which, in a way, he did. He was 46, with the kind of jawline that came from generations of people who had never worried about money, and the kind of eyes that looked at other people and calculated what they could take. He held a patient chart, and his presence made the air pressure in the room change, the way it changed when thunderstorms rolled in from the coast. He was tall. He moved with the confidence of someone who had never seriously considered the possibility that he might fail. His gaze settled on Danielle, who was still methodically working through the chest tube trays, checking the sterility seals, ensuring that the materials matched the inventory list. "Checking your work again?" Dr. Hargrove asked, and the tone of his voice suggested that this was the kind of thing a person who lacked confidence in their own abilities would do. Danielle didn't look up. "Standard protocol, Dr. Hargrove." "Standard protocol is a physician-ordered verification," he said, and he stepped closer, the implication clear that a nurse checking the supplies was overstepping some boundary he had established in his own mind. "You might consider focusing on your own responsibilities." She did look up then, met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to register the architecture of his expression, the small smile that was meant to convey dominance, the slight narrowing of his pupils that indicated he was prepared to escalate if she challenged him. She had seen this expression before, but in different contexts. She had seen it on the faces of men who had decided that other people were available for their use. It was a particular kind of predatory certainty that some people carried. "Yes, Dr. Hargrove," Danielle said, and she returned to her work without giving him the satisfaction of the argument he seemed to be engineering. He stood there for another moment, clearly waiting for something, a justification, a defensiveness, some evidence that his comment had landed, and when none came, he moved toward the patient rooms. She heard him checking charts, his movements sharp and efficient, the sounds of a man who was competent at his job and aware of it in a way that suggested he believed competence granted him permission for things. 30 seconds. That's all it took to change the tenor of a room. Danielle finished the crash cart and moved to patient bed 7, the cardiac tamponade case, the one with the billing discrepancy. The patient was a 72-year-old construction foreman named Howard Mills who had experienced sudden chest pain during a routine colonoscopy, and by the time they'd gotten him to the ICU, his pericardium had filled with 300 milliliters of fluid that was compressing his heart. The echocardiography had confirmed the diagnosis in the afternoon, and the pericardiocentesis, the needle insertion into the sac surrounding the heart, the slow withdrawal of the fluid that was strangling the cardiac output, had been performed by the cardiology attending at 1,510 hours, not at 1847 hours as the billing documentation indicated. She checked his vitals. Blood pressure 118/72, stable. O2 saturation 97% on supplemental oxygen. Heart rate 84, regular. The man's chest rose and fell with the gentle rhythm of someone whose heart was beating normally again, whose pericardium was no longer compressing the organ into insufficient contractility. He was sleeping, his body doing the work of healing. "How's he looking?" Marcus asked from behind her, and she knew he wasn't asking about the vitals displayed on the monitor. "Good," Danielle said. "Better than he did 4 hours ago." "Because of the procedure," Marcus said, and it wasn't a question. "The echo actually found it, and the attending actually drained it." "Yes," Danielle said, and she didn't elaborate, because elaboration wasn't necessary. She was restocking the supply cart outside Howard Mills's room when the Marine Corpsman appeared. His name was Kyle Brennan, and he worked in the hospital's trauma bay, assisting surgeons with the most critical cases. He was 28, built like someone who had survived on discipline and purpose, with the kind of eyes that had seen things that changed the trajectory of how you understood the world. He was there because one of the ICU patients had developed acute abdominal pain, and the attending had requested assistance with a potential emergency decompression. Kyle stopped when he saw Danielle preparing the chest tube insertion tray. It was something about her hand position, the way her fingers arranged the components. Her right hand held the curved instrument in a specific grip, 3 fingers supporting the curve, thumb and forefinger managing the grip width. It was a technique that minimized hand fatigue during extended field procedures. It was the kind of technique that you learned in a specific context. It was not something you learned in nursing school. It was something you learned when you needed to keep people alive in environments where electricity and running water and hospital beds didn't exist. "You need assistance?" Kyle asked, and his voice had changed. It had taken on the quality of someone who had suddenly realized they were standing next to something that required a different kind of attention. "Possibly," Danielle said. "If the attending decides on intervention." But she knew why he was asking. She could see it in the precise adjustment of his posture, the way his eyes tracked the movement of her hands as she positioned the instruments in the insertion tray. The chest tube insertion was a procedure that required absolute precision, that required hand control that could only come from repetition in high-stakes contexts. She had performed it approximately 217 times. Most of those times, she had been doing it in the darkness. Most of those times, the patient's blood pressure had been uncontrollable. Most of those times, she had been working by the light of a tactical flashlight clamped between her teeth while rounds went overhead. The attending arrived within minutes, and the procedure began. The patient was conscious, in pain but stable. The attending was competent. But it was Kyle who watched Danielle as she assisted, his eyes locked on her hands, on the 3-finger vascular clamp grip that could only mean one thing. She could feel the weight of his recognition the way you felt the weight of a weapon pointed at your chest, not hostile, but intensely present. When the procedure was complete and the patient's collapsed lung was re-expanded, the attending left to document the intervention. Kyle remained, helping Danielle break down the insertion tray, disposing of the used materials, restocking the supplies. "Remedy," he said quietly. "Not a question." 2006. Danielle didn't look at him. She continued working, her movements unchanged, her focus on the inventory list in front of her. The tactical flexibility she had learned in environments where stopping to engage with recognition could get you killed remained her default response. Keep working. Keep scanning the room. Don't acknowledge things that might become complications. "Your ghost," Kyle whispered, and it wasn't accusation. It was the tone of someone who had understood, very suddenly, that they were in the presence of something they had read about in classified debriefs, something they had heard referenced in conversations with other operators who had been there, something that the military had officially decided never happened. She met his eyes then, and gave him the smallest head shake. The kind of shake that was barely visible. The kind of shake that meant, yes, and we are never speaking of this again. The kind of shake that communicated across the distance of 17 years and thousands of miles the absolute certainty that there were some things that the military ordered you to forget, and if you wanted to stay alive in your new life, you would forget them. Kyle understood. He was the kind of operator who would understand. He finished helping her restock the tray, made a small nod that was the military equivalent of a salute, and left without another word. He would not tell anyone what he had recognized in her hand position. He would not mention it in conversations. He would not think about it, or he would learn to think about it only in the privacy of his own mind, where such thoughts could remain sealed off from the rest of his civilian existence. Some operators stayed buried. That was the deal you made when you agreed to disappear into a life of normalcy. You stayed buried, and the world stayed safe from whatever it was you had been trained to do. Danielle finished her rounds at 0530, made her notes in the electronic health records, and sat in the break room with a cup of Marcus's coffee that was indeed strong enough to stand up by itself. The sun would rise in 30 minutes. The day shift would arrive. She would hand off her patients and drive home to the small apartment where she lived with her daughter, and she would sleep for 5 hours before picking her up from school. This was her life now. Night shifts and quiet work and the careful construction of a person who had never jumped out of helicopters, who had never performed emergency procedures under fire, who had no combat decorations hanging in a box under her bed, who was simply a nurse. Just a nurse who paid attention to details. Just a nurse whose hands remembered things her mind had been ordered to forget. The quiet little mouse won't last a week. That's what Dr. Hargrove announced in the Mercy General cafeteria on a Tuesday morning, loud enough for everyone to hear. He stood near the beverage station with a coffee cup in one hand and contempt in his eyes, surveying the staff like a lion assessing prey. 12 nurses, 3 residents, 4 techs, all turned to look. The bet was casual. The cruelty was precise. "Any takers?" he asked, his smile the kind that shows teeth but never reaches the eyes. Danielle Ross was 2 tables away, alone with her oatmeal and black coffee, her hospital badge clipped to her scrubs at a precise 45-degree angle. She didn't look up. She didn't flinch. The spoon moved to her mouth, steady as a surgical laser. Around the room, nurses exchanged glances, some sympathetic, some nervous, a few actually placing mental bets on how long before the quiet night shift nurse would crack under Hargrove's attention. Nobody wagered on her lasting past Friday. She'd been at Mercy General for 5 years. 5 years of double-checking every chart before filing, of arriving 30 minutes early and leaving 30 minutes late, of speaking only when spoken to and then using the minimum number of words required. 5 years of being invisible. That invisibility had kept her safe. It had kept her secrets buried in the kind of unmarked grave the Pentagon preferred. But Hargrove had noticed her anyway, and his notice felt like a spotlight in a dark room where she'd learned to survive. The bet hung in the cafeteria air like antiseptic fumes. Danielle finished her oatmeal. She stood. She carried her tray to the disposal station. Nobody watched her leave, but Hargrove did. His jaw tightened in that particular way that meant he'd noticed the lack of reaction, and he hated it. 2 hours later, same cafeteria, packed with staff on lunch break. The smell of overheated plastic food containers and reconstituted chicken broth filled the space. Danielle sat at the corner table, her back to the wall, a habit that died hard, even in a hospital cafeteria. Her sandwich was half-eaten when Dr. Hargrove walked past. His hip caught her tray with what might have looked accidental to someone not trained in reading violence. Might have. Her lunch scattered. Apple slices across the tile floor. A yogurt cup that spun in 2 slow rotations before stopping. The sandwich, butter side down, leaving a small grease stain. The room didn't go silent immediately. It took 3 seconds, people registering what they'd seen, then understanding that they'd seen it, then deciding what to do with that knowledge. By the second, the room was dead silent. Danielle stood. She wiped her scrubs with a paper napkin. Food debris clung to the front of her shirt, and she brushed it away with the kind of careful attention she gave to everything, methodical, precise, devoid of emotion. A single tear escaped down her left cheek. She didn't hide it. She didn't turn away. She simply wiped it away with the back of her hand while maintaining eye contact with Hargrove. Her eyes were the color of winter sky before a storm, flat, clear, absolutely still. She knelt and began picking up the scattered food. Other nurses looked away. A tech from radiology pretended he hadn't seen anything. Hargrove stood 6 feet from her, watching, his presence making the air pressure change the way it does when a predator has marked its territory. He was waiting for her to cry harder. Waiting for visible distress. Waiting for her to say something that would confirm his assessment, just a quiet little mouse, exactly as he'd announced. She finished cleaning. She disposed of the napkins. She didn't speak. 2 days later, Dr. Hargrove found her during evening rounds. He called her to the nurses' station in front of 6 other staff members. His voice carried the particular pitch of a man about to perform a small cruelty for an audience. He had a patient chart in his hands. Marcus Chen, the IT department's veteran administrator, happened to be filing something at the nearby desk, and his fingers stilled over the keyboard. "This chart is a mess," Hargrove said. He didn't hand it to her. He dropped it. The paper scattered across the tile floor, and the sound of them hitting the ground carried with it all the weight of intention. "Pick that up, sweetheart." His arms crossed. His smirk was the kind worn by men who had never experienced consequences. Behind him, the other nurses found sudden interest in their monitors and tablets and anything that wasn't the small woman kneeling to retrieve scattered papers. Danielle took one measured breath. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. She simply looked up at him, and when she did, another tear escaped, but this one she didn't wipe away until after she spoke. The tear traced a perfect line down her cheek while she maintained eye contact with a steadiness that would have made a sniper proud. "I've been shot at by better men than you, Doctor." The words were quiet. The words were level. The words were delivered in a voice that carried the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst the world can offer. She wiped the tear away. She collected the remaining charts. She stood without waiting for a response, and she returned to her work as if he hadn't spoken, as if he didn't exist, as if she was alone in a room with 10 people watching. Hargrove laughed. The sound echoed across the nurses' station with the desperate quality of a performance that hadn't landed. "Melodrama," he announced to no one in particular. "See what I mean?" Nobody answered. But Marcus Chen, watching from his desk, didn't laugh. His fingers had gone motionless over his keyboard, and something in his expression shifted, a recognition, perhaps, or a calculation. The other nurses avoided looking at Danielle, which was its own kind of answer. The next words out of Hargrove's mouth changed the game entirely. He walked to his office and closed the door. Inside, he picked up his phone. The caller ID on his first call read Hospital Board Chairman. His voice dropped to the particular tone reserved for favors and leverage. "I need background on Danielle Ross, the night shift nurse in the ICU. Something's off about her." The chairman owed Hargrove favors, 3 of them, to be precise, dating back to when Hargrove had covered up a malpractice case involving the chairman's nephew. The chairman didn't ask questions. "I'll have our HR pull her file." "What are we looking for?" "Inconsistencies. Gaps. Anything that doesn't fit." The second call went to a private investigator in San Diego, a man who specialized in background checks and who asked fewer questions than most. "Her employment history only goes back 5 years, Hargrove said. Before that, nothing. It's like she didn't exist. Find out why. Find something I can use." The investigator made a note. Danielle Ross. 5 years. Before that, nothing. He'd find it, investigators always did, eventually. The third call was carefully placed to a man named Victor who ran a pill mill out of a clinic in East County. Victor owed Hargrove a favor. Hargrove was cashing it in. "If anyone calls asking about Danielle Ross, you tell them she worked for you. Tell them she was terminated for narcotic theft. Can you do that?" Victor agreed. Free referrals to pain management patients in exchange for a cover story. Simple economics. Hargrove hung up and sat in the darkness of his office, and what he didn't know was that his insurance fraud scheme, the 3 years of billing for procedures never performed, the kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives totaling upward of $240,000, the falsified charts and documented patient harm, depended entirely on control of the ICU. And Danielle Ross, with her methodical chart reviews and her meticulous attention to detail, was a threat he couldn't tolerate. She had to go before she saw the pattern. Before her careful eye connected the dots between his procedure codes and the medications he ordered and the patients who showed improvement with suspicious consistency. She had to disappear before she became a liability. He didn't know what he was trying to erase. He only knew that her presence was threatening everything he'd built, and that her composure under humiliation was somehow more terrifying than if she'd broken down entirely. In her car that evening, parked in the hospital lot, Danielle sat with her hands on the steering wheel and her eyes focused on the darkening sky above San Diego. 15 minutes. That's how long she sat there. Her breathing was controlled. Her mind was already recalculating contingencies, exit strategies, the familiar patterns of a life that had taught her how to disappear on short notice. The 7th Marine Regiment operated with the understanding that some assets became expendable. She had learned that lesson in Ramadi. Now she was learning it again, but this time from a man in a pressed suit rather than an insurgent in the desert. She started the car and drove home to her 7-year-old daughter, who would ask why she was home early, and Danielle would have no answer that wouldn't require revealing a past she'd been ordered to forget. At 2:02 in the morning, the electrical system behind the wall of ICU room 4 began to arc, sparks scattered like tiny meteors in the darkness between the drywall. The fire was born in those invisible spaces where no one was watching, where insurance inspections never quite reached, where the hospital's aging infrastructure held its breath and finally, catastrophically, exhaled. 90 seconds later, smoke poured into the corridor like a living thing hunting for oxygen. The fire alarm screamed. Not the routine testing beep. The full 7-second crescendo that sent every nervous system in the building into overdrive. Lights flashed in the main hallway. Red and amber strobes turned the sterile white corridors into something from a combat zone. The kind of sensory overload designed to trigger panic. Designed to make people run. Dr. Hargrove emerged from the physician's break room on the 3rd floor, a coffee cup in his hand. He'd been reviewing medical board minutes, calculating how much pressure he could apply before Danielle's termination became unavoidable. The alarm hit him like a physical blow. He didn't hesitate. He didn't run to check on patients. He turned toward the stairwell exit, his expensive Italian loafers clicking against the tile in a rhythm that matched the screaming alarm. 3 other staff members followed him. The cafeteria worker. The night shift administrator. 2 residents who'd frozen for exactly 2 seconds before instinct overrode protocol. No one looked back. Danielle was in the supply closet on the ICU floor restocking crash cart medications when the alarm began. She set down the box of epinephrine vials with deliberate care, waiting for the moment of panic that never came. Her breathing remained steady. The kind of steady that comes from having already survived worse. From having held that kind of fear in her hand so many times it became just another vital sign to monitor. She moved toward the smoke. The corridor was a grey wall now, the fluorescent panels above barely visible through the haze. The sprinkler system had activated, but the fire was winning. Somewhere in that smoke was the ICU, rooms 1 through 12, patient monitors still pulsing with the lives contained inside them. Emergency lighting flickered to life along the baseboards, casting everything in a murky amber glow. The smell hit her immediately, burning insulation, ozone, and beneath it all, the chemical signature of old electrical fires, the same smell she'd encountered during a compound breach in Ramadi 17 years ago, the building they'd been clearing engulfed in flames from insurgent IEDs. Pain was information. Fear was data. She'd learned that in the desert. She learned it again now, faster and clearer than any civilian nurse could process. She ran into room 4. The patient was a Marine. 24 years old, 3 days post-cardiac surgery at Balboa Naval Hospital, transferred to Mercy General for complications. His name was Marcus Chen. He had a wife and a mother. He had a 2-year-old daughter learning to say his name. The monitors above his bed were dead, no power, no electronic readouts, just the flat grey screens of useless equipment. In the emergency lighting, she could see him clearly, pale, gasping, his neck veins distended like purple ropes beneath his skin. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac, compressing the heart from the outside. The very definition of a life with a countdown attached. His oxygen saturation was probably around 70. Maybe worse. The kind of number that meant his brain was already being starved. Maybe 3 minutes. Maybe less. She had no attending physician. No backup. No authorization. No power on the machines that were supposed to monitor what she was about to do. What she was about to do was a procedure restricted to emergency room physicians and cardiologists. What she was about to do would end her career the moment anyone found out. She pulled out her phone and used it as a flashlight. The beam was steady in her hands. People always noticed that first. The steadiness. A Marine corpsman in Ramadi had once told her that her hands were the only thing about her that felt like stone. Everything else was camouflage. The hands told the truth. She grabbed a sterile field from the crash cart, her fingers moving through the sequence without conscious thought. The body remembered. The body always remembered. She found the angiocath, 18 gauge, long enough to reach deep enough. The pericardium was a sac around the heart, meant to protect it, designed by evolution to create a sealed space. The problem with a sealed space is that if something, blood, fluid, air, fills that space, the pressure builds and the heart can no longer beat. Drainage was the answer. A needle inserted just beneath the xiphoid process, angled upward at 30 degrees, advancing slowly until the needle entered the pericardial membrane and felt the pop that meant she'd done it right. She prepped the site by phone flashlight. His gasping had become almost silent now, the breathing of someone whose body was shutting down. His wife's name was Sarah. Her name had been on the whiteboard at the foot of the bed. Sarah and a daughter named Emma. 3-year-old, not 2. Danielle had seen the photo taped to his monitor. Her hands found the needle. Advanced it. The angle had to be perfect, too shallow and she'd miss the pericardium entirely, too steep and she'd perforate the right ventricle and watch him bleed to death in front of her. The needle moved through layers of tissue. Skin. Fascia. The membrane itself. The pop came at exactly the right moment. Dark blood filled the syringe. Not bright red. Not the color of fresh arterial blood. The kind of dark that meant it had been collecting, pressing, slowly asphyxiating the patient from the outside in. She drew it back slowly, feeling the immediate change in his physiology. His gasping eased. His color shifted from gray toward something approaching pink. The monitors remained dead, but she could see his pulse in his neck now, visible in his skin, returning to something resembling normal. There, she said quietly. 2 syllables. 1 word. She needed jello and a strong cup of coffee. She needed 8 hours of sleep. She needed very much to be someone else. Instead, she was moving to room 5. Smoke was heavier now. The fire was eating through walls. She could hear it, a sound like nothing taught in civilian training, the sound of a building deciding to fail. She evacuated a patient with 3rd-degree burns from an acetylene torch accident 3 weeks prior, his lungs already compromised, now facing smoke inhalation in the middle of the night. She guided him to the stairwell, her hand steady on his shoulder. Gave him to the firefighters who were arriving, boots thundering up the stairs. Room 6. Room 7. A patient with end-stage renal disease, unconscious, her daughter asleep in the chair beside her bed. Danielle carried them both to safety, one in her arms, one guided by her free hand. A patient 2 days post-op from an emergency appendectomy, terrified, moving slowly because his surgical site was fresh and torn. She stayed with him all the way to the ground floor where paramedics took over. By the time the fire department got the blaze under control, it was 2:17. 12 minutes elapsed. For lives directly saved by her intervention. 3 more evacuated by her guidance. 1 more, a cardiac patient in room 12, who might have coded without the calm voice telling him to breathe, to move, to trust her. By dawn, she'd given her statement to the fire investigator. A woman named Torres with tired eyes and a notebook. Danielle described the electrical fire, the smoke progression, the patient in room 4. She described the pericardiocentesis with clinical precision, using the exact terminology, not hiding anything, not softening the reality of what she'd done. Torres's pen stopped moving. You performed an invasive surgical procedure. It was the only option. Danielle's voice was quiet. Exactly the same tone as always. He was in tamponade. Did an attending authorize this? There was no time. Torres wrote something down. Her expression didn't change. She'd been a firefighter for 23 years. She'd seen emergency medicine practiced by people with nothing left to lose. She understood the mathematics of survival better than most. By noon, Dr. Hargrove had called an emergency meeting with the hospital board chairman, a man named Sterling who'd hired him 7 years ago and had been receiving kickbacks from his pharmaceutical schemes ever since. The conversation lasted 14 minutes. She performed unauthorized invasive procedures during the crisis, Hargrove said, his voice carrying the tone of someone protecting the hospital's interests. Liability exposure is enormous. We need immediate termination and an incident review to show we took action. Sterling, who was significantly less competent than he believed himself to be, agreed immediately. By 1:30, hospital security was notified. By 3 o'clock, Danielle had been called to administration. By 4, she was carrying a small cardboard box toward the exit. Inside the box were 2 things, her employee badge and a pair of worn combat boots she'd kept in her locker for 17 years. The boots were from her last deployment in Ramadi, the soles worn thin from patrol routes she'd never detail, the laces still caked with sand that wouldn't come clean. They were the only physical things she'd kept from a life that was supposed to be erased completely. A life the government had ordered her to forget. Security walked her to the parking lot. They were professional about it. Not unkind. Just following protocol. Her hands didn't shake. Her face showed nothing. She'd been taught, in a series of training exercises in a place she couldn't mention to anyone, how to process loss without showing it. How to carry grief the way soldiers carry weapons, with absolute precision and zero wasted motion. She drove home. 18 minutes. She didn't exceed the speed limit. She didn't cry in the car. She thought about Sarah Chen and Emma Chen and a Marine who was alive because she'd run toward smoke instead of away from it. She thought about the things she'd been taught in the desert and how those things had saved a life in a hospital corridor at 2 in the morning. She thought about the fact that she'd just become unemployable in the only civilian work she'd ever known. By dawn, Dr. Hargrove's hands had stopped shaking. Fear had crystallized into something colder and sharper, tactical necessity. He sat in his office with the door locked, coffee gone tepid beside him, and made the first call at 06 for 7. The hospital board chairman answered on the second ring. Hargrove knew the man owed him, he knew about the offshore account, the daughter's tuition paid in cash, the 3 medical board violations quietly buried. "We have a problem," Hargrove said. "The nurse from last night. She performed unauthorized procedures during the crisis. Emergency pericardiocentesis. No attending present. Protocol violation of the highest order." The chairman's voice tightened. Was the patient saved? That's not the point. She exceeded her scope of practice. Dangerous precedent. Silence. Then, "I'll make a call." The second call came at 0715 to a phone number Hargrove had purchased 3 months ago, a burner line connected to a woman in Sacramento who'd never actually worked at Mercy General. She'd worked at 3 hospitals, actually, but not the same one. Hargrove had used her for references before. "I need you to be someone I supervised," he said. Danielle Ross. Fired her for narcotic diversion. Theft from the medication dispensary. "Can you confirm that on official letterhead?" The woman laughed. That's a felony accusation. She won't prosecute. She'll just leave. 5,000. 3. 4,500. He transferred it immediately. By 0816, a falsified termination letter from a fictional supervisor at a hospital 3 states away existed in triplicate. The third call was to a private investigator, a man with grey temples and no scruples, someone Hargrove had used to find leverage on nursing board members before. "I need a background investigation," Hargrove said. "Rush job. This woman's employment history doesn't add up. She claims 5 years in nursing. I need you to tell me why the years before that are missing." "How missing?" "She appears to not exist before 2019. The investigator whistled low. "That's either witness protection or military. Find out which." "Find everything. I'll pay double your usual rate if you have something by end of business." By 0900, the machinery was in motion. Hargrove sat back in his chair and allowed himself a thin smile. Whatever she was, whoever she'd been, it would take her weeks to prove her employment history. By then, she'd already be gone. The hospital board chairman called him at 10:30. "It's done. The board voted. She's terminated, effective immediately, for unauthorized medical procedures. Scope of practice violation. We're documenting it as a safety concern." Danielle arrived at Mercy General at 10:45 for her shift, unaware that security had already been notified. She'd changed in her locker room, pulled on fresh scrubs, checked her badge. At 10:52, the security director found her at the medication dispensary, reviewing the morning inventory with another nurse. "Ms. Ross, you need to come with me." The other nurse's eyes widened. Danielle's expression didn't change. She set down her clipboard and followed the director to the administrative office without a word. The hospital HR manager was already there, along with legal counsel, an actual attorney, which was unusual and which meant someone was very worried about lawsuit. "Ms. Ross," the HR manager began, "we've made the difficult decision to terminate your employment, effective immediately. You performed unauthorized emergency procedures during last night's ICU fire. Emergency pericardiocentesis. You are not authorized to perform that procedure without direct physician supervision and explicit approval. This represents a serious scope of practice violation and a patient safety concern." Danielle's hands were steady. "The patient would have died." "That may be true, but you performed a surgical procedure without." The attending fled. "The patient was in full cardiac arrest. Pericardial effusion. You should have waited for." There was no time to wait. The attorney leaned forward. "Which is why we're not pressing criminal charges. But the hospital cannot retain you. The liability is substantial. Security will escort you to clear your locker. Your final paycheck will be mailed." Danielle nodded once. She stood. "How long do I have?" 15 minutes. Security walked her through the corridor, the same corridor where she'd saved for lives 8 hours ago. Staff members watched her pass. Some looked ashamed. Others looked relieved. One looked like he might cry, but Danielle didn't pause to see who it was. Her locker was in the break room. She opened it with her key and began removing her things. 2 weeks of scrubs. A spare pair of socks. A photo of her daughter. And at the bottom, wrapped in an old Navy SEAL bag and buried under everything else, a pair of combat boots with the laces still tied, boots that had walked through Ramadi in 2006, boots that had been removed in a classified debrief room at Kandahar, boots that had been mailed to a P.O. box under an assumed name 5 years ago and carried in a moving truck to San Diego where a woman named Danielle Ross had begun a life that never existed before. She placed them gently in a small cardboard box, along with everything else. Security walked her to the parking lot. The sun was brutal on the asphalt. The San Diego heat was already climbing toward 94 degrees. She placed the box in the passenger seat and drove home with both hands on the wheel. She arrived at 1857, 3 hours early, still in her hospital scrubs, the smell of antiseptic and adrenaline still embedded in the fabric. The house was quiet. Her daughter's toys scattered across the living room in the particular chaos of afternoon play. She sat at the kitchen table without removing her scrubs. The termination letter was still in her hand, creased from being gripped too tightly during the walk to the car. At 19:04, she heard the back door open. Small feet. Her daughter, breathless from playing in the yard, dropping her shoes by the door. "Mommy." The girl stopped when she saw her. 7 years old, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's sharp cheekbones. "Why aren't you at work? Are you sick?" Danielle opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. The words wouldn't come. Not words that made sense. Not words that wouldn't lead to other questions, questions that required answers she'd been ordered never to give. Her daughter crossed the kitchen and climbed into her lap. "You smell like the hospital." Danielle pulled her close. The girl's small arms wrapped around her neck. And for the first time in 5 years, since the day she'd been officially resurrected from the grave and handed a civilian identity, Danielle Ross allowed herself to break. Not in the cafeteria. Not in front of staff. Not where anyone could see. But here, in the kitchen of a house in San Diego that she'd bought with pension money that technically belonged to a woman who'd been dead for 5 years, with her daughter's hair against her cheek and no answer to give except silence. They sat like that until 1943. Until the girl fell asleep in her arms. Until Danielle carried her upstairs and laid her down in her bed and pulled the pink comforter to her chin and stood in the doorway watching her breathe. Then she went downstairs to the living room, sat on the floor against the couch, and opened the small box. The combat boots were still there. Still smelled like desert and oil and the past. She ran her thumb across the leather, scarred and cracked, the laces knotted with dried blood that had never come out. In Ramadi, 2006, she'd run into a collapsing building 3 times. 11 Marines. Shrapnel in her back and legs. Each time she'd gone in, her hands had moved on muscle memory. Pain was information. Blood was just data. Her job was to get them out. The job tonight had been the same. For lives. Same objective. Same result. Same reason she'd just lost the only legitimate employment she'd ever known. She held the boots and stared at nothing while the San Diego night pressed against the windows. 48 hours later, the doorbell rang. Exactly 48 hours after the fire, the doorbell rang at 1,400 hours. 3 vehicles, Marine Corps olive drab, engine still running, lined the residential street outside Danielle's townhouse. Neighbors emerged onto porches like magnetized iron. A 2-star general stepped from the lead Humvee, his dress blues sharp enough to cut glass, he's bearing the kind of authority that made the air pressure change. He walked to her door alone. Behind him, a Navy SEAL commander in tactical gear stood with his hands at his sides, and 3 FBI agents fanned across the front lawn in windbreakers that read Federal Bureau of Investigation in reflective letters. The general knocked. Not a request. A command. Danielle opened the door, still wearing yesterday's scrubs, her daughter behind her clutching a juice box. The general's eyes met hers and his jaw tightened. He said, "Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross." Loud enough that every neighbor within 60 feet heard every word. The clipboard in his hands trembled. Her daughter's head snapped sideways. "Mom, you're a senior chief." The voice cracked with confusion and something else, pride bleeding through confusion like blood through gauze. The general stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway like floodwater. "I need to read you something." His voice steadied but his hands didn't. He opened the file. Inside, hospital records, fire department logs, medical notes. The patient in bay for during the ICU fire at 0200 yesterday was my son. Colonel James Morrison, Jr., attached to Camp Lejeune. Attending physician notes indicate he was in full cardiac tamponade, his heart was being crushed by blood in the pericardial sac. The general's eyes glossed. He had for minutes. Maybe less. The neighbors had stopped pretending not to listen. Someone's phone was filming. You performed an emergency pericardiocentesis by flashlight. No attending physician. No authorization. No protocol. You saved his life. The SEAL commander stepped forward. His uniform bore a trident pin the color of gold, the Navy SEAL insignia. He carried himself like a man who had walked through fire and didn't blink. "Senior Chief Ross," he said, his voice steady as a surgical laser, "the decoration records that were classified until 47 minutes ago list the following medals for the Ramadi Operation, 2006. He paused. Every word landed like a dropped weight. Bronze Star with Valor for exceptional service under fire. Neighbors shifted. Someone whispered. 2 Silver Stars. His voice didn't change. 1 for leadership during the assault on Jolan District. 1 for casualty evacuation under sustained hostile fire. He opened another folder. The medals inside caught the afternoon light. Navy Cross. He held the decoration up to the sunlight. For extraordinary heroism while pulling 11 Marines from a collapsing building during the fall of Ramadi while taking shrapnel to your thoracic spine and right shoulder. The SEAL's eyes never left hers. You finished the rescue with a fractured clavicle. The intel community thought you were dead for 6 weeks. An FBI agent stepped forward, his badge on a lanyard, his face the color of bureaucratic competence. "I'm Special Agent William Reeves, White Collar Crime Division." His voice had the tone of a man about to end careers. "We've been investigating Dr. Marcus Hargrove's insurance billing fraud for 4 months. Kickbacks from pharmaceutical representatives. Procedures billed but never performed. Patient trauma data fabricated for research grants." The agent held up a tablet. On the screen, timestamp 2:17 a.m., Dr. Hargrove in the ICU hallway. Looking at the smoke. Looking at the flames. Then turning and walking toward the exit. "Our witness, Marcus Chen, your IT specialist and a Marine Corps veteran, preserved security footage that Dr. Hargrove attempted to delete at 0200 yesterday morning. The footage shows Dr. Hargrove leaving the ICU. It also shows you entering." The footage played. Danielle in scrubs, moving toward the flames while others ran away. The agent's jaw tightened. The patient she saved, the general's son, would have died if that fire had started 30 seconds later. He would have been pronounced dead within 5 minutes of cardiac arrest if Senior Chief Ross hadn't performed that procedure. A car pulled up. Dr. Hargrove stepped out, his face the color of old bone. His mouth opened to say something, to defend, to deflect, to deny. The FBI agent held up his hand. One gesture. Hargrove's mouth closed. "The board chairman who approved your termination yesterday resigned 1 hour ago after we informed him of his legal exposure," the agent said flatly. "Marcus Chen has provided documentation showing that you called him personally at 0930 hours and ordered him to delete all security footage from the ICU at 0200. That's tampering with evidence. Federal crime." The agent nodded to 2 other agents. They stepped toward Hargrove. He took 2 steps backward. "Your medical license is under emergency suspension as of 1100 hours this morning. The California Medical Board has issued a notice of revocation pending the outcome of this investigation. You are not under arrest at this moment, but you are the subject of a federal investigation into conspiracy, fraud, and obstruction of justice." Hargrove's face went slack. The neighbors could see it from their porches, the moment a man's world collapsed. 3 nurses from Mercy General emerged from a second vehicle, their scrubs bright blue against the afternoon. One approached Danielle with tears streaming down her face. "We're so sorry. We should have stood up for you. We knew what he was doing and we said nothing." The other 2 nurses nodded, their shame visible like a stain. Rodriguez, the Marine Corpsman who had recognized her 3-finger clamp technique 6 weeks ago, stepped from the crowd in dress uniform. He saluted her, his fist striking his chest once, the sound sharp as a gunshot. It echoed down the residential street. Every neighbor who witnessed it understood they had just seen someone honor someone else. The general looked at Danielle and extended his hand. "Thank you for my son." 2 years later, the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center occupied 300 acres overlooking the Potomac River. Danielle's office was on the 4th floor of the Combat Trauma Building. Her nameplate read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, Director of Combat Medical Training. On her shelf sat the worn combat boots, no longer hidden, no longer a secret. Beside them, a photograph. General Morrison in dress blues, pinning a medal to her uniform. The Medal of Honor. The ribbon was navy and white. The pendant showed an eagle perched on an anchor. It had taken 18 months for the Ramadi operation to be declassified. When it was, every news outlet in the country ran the story of Ghost, the classified operator who had saved 11 Marines in a collapsing building, who had buried her own identity for 7 years, who had become a night shift nurse at a San Diego hospital, and who had saved lives in the ICU the way she had saved Marines in the desert, with hands steady enough to hold the balance between life and death. Her daughter visited on weekends now. She was 9 years old. She wore a hoodie that said, "My mom is a war hero," and told her classmates her mother had pulled people from burning buildings. She didn't quite understand the military part yet, but she understood that her mother was different from other mothers. Danielle had stopped wearing borrowed normalcy. The two halves of her life, the warrior and the healer, were no longer fighting each other. They were the same person, and the same person was teaching the next generation of Navy corpsmen how to save lives when the world stopped making sense. A community college in Northern Virginia. Evening classes. The fluorescent lights hummed their tired hum. Dr. Marcus Hargrove stood in front of 23 teenagers fulfilling a health requirement, teaching CPR certification. His medical license had been permanently revoked. The FBI had secured convictions on 14 counts of fraud. He had served 18 months in federal prison. He was 57 years old and would never practice medicine again. His annual salary was $31,400. He would teach this class 3 nights a week for the rest of his working life, and nobody in that room knew who he was or what he had done. Nobody cared. He was just a man teaching chest compressions to teenagers who wanted their certification signed so they could move on with their lives. Danielle stood before a room of 28 Navy corpsmen, the youngest combat medic class of the year. They wore dress uniforms. They had just been selected for the most advanced trauma training available to enlisted personnel. Her hands held a surgical scalpel. The blade caught the overhead lights. Some of you will face situations where there is no physician, no backup, no protocol manual you can reference, she said. Her voice had the tone of someone who had already been through the worst and come out the other side. You will have a patient who is dying and you will have to decide what rules to break to save them. Your hands will have to remember what no file can show. Your judgment will be the only authority. She raised the scalpel. The bravest warriors aren't the ones who carry guns. Sometimes they carry stethoscopes. And sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one holding everyone else together. The corpsmen leaned forward. They understood they were being taught by someone who had crossed a line and lived. They understood that sometimes, staying within protocol meant watching people die. They understood that sometimes, being brave meant breaking rules. The camera zoomed slowly on the shelf. The worn combat boots. The Medal of Honor photograph. The voices of young Marines asking questions, writing notes, preparing for missions nobody could predict. The boots had walked through Ramadi in 2006. They had walked through Mercy General San Diego in scrubs. They had walked to that townhouse door when the general knocked. They were still walking. They would keep walking. And everyone who saw them would understand, heroes don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they keep their heads down. Sometimes they work night shifts. Sometimes they save lives one patient at a time, until the moment comes when they save everyone. If you've made it this far, you understand that some of the most powerful people in the world are the ones nobody's watching. Subscribe to see more stories about the warriors who chose to heal. Like this video if you've ever been underestimated. And comment, have you ever known someone whose real strength was hidden until the moment it mattered most?